Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you're linking in from. I'm Greg Hagin, managing partner with CCS Fundraising, and absolutely delighted that you've decided to spend your time with us today on this important topic. This is our Philanthropy Outlook, and we're excited about this research and thinking about how the 2025 tax reform might impact charitable giving in the US, not just in 2026 and 27, but and beyond, because a number of these factors have implications over a multi-year period. As we get going here, just on the next slide, I do want to make sure that we introduce today's distinguished guests and panelists. And I will be joined in this conversation by Patrick Rooney, who's the Executive Associate Dean at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. Patrick is a pioneering scholar, researcher, and nationally recognized expert in the impact of economics and tax policy on philanthropy. He founded the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy's research unit, building it into one of the nation's premier philanthropy research organizations. His numerous leadership roles include helping found the school and serving on many nonprofit boards and national advisory committees. Patrick, thank you for joining us today. I also want to introduce our distinguished friend and personal friend, Kat Rosqueta, founding executive director of the Center for High Impact Philanthropy. Kat is also a member, I should share, of the CCS Board of Directors, which we're thrilled about, a nationally recognized leader in high impact philanthropy, and as the founding executive director of CHIP, the Center for High Impact Philanthropy at the University of Pennsylvania. She's really dedicated and devoted her career helping donors, funders, and social sector leaders use evidence and insight to strengthen their impact. So I did want to acknowledge Kat and Patrick, and we're very excited to dive into this. This conversation, this research was really developed in partnership with the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. It is built on various data sets, including national IRS and some survey data and some economic modeling. And it's really based to project what might happen. So we're looking at what actually did happen with the tax changes, how that might impact donor behavior. And then thirdly, how does that fit more broadly in the context of philanthropy in years and trends and insights ahead? And I'd be remiss also not to acknowledge, and I submit this humbly, that CCS was recently named as part of Forbes' 2026 list of America's best management consulting firms. And it's a really meaningful milestone for our company, our partners, our board, all of our employees, and really for our team, and one that we believe reflects the trust of our clients and our peers across the sectors. So thank you for permitting me to offer that recognition and acknowledgement. And then finally, just on a logistical note, before we really dive in here, there is a Q&A feature, and that's going to be open throughout today's webinar. So please do feel free to submit questions as they come to mind. And across one of the report's authors, in fact, John Betterall, will be answering these questions live in the chat. So while Patrick, Kat, and I will have conversation, and we want to reserve enough space toward the end, we want to make sure that things are addressed throughout. So with that said, why don't I just go through a few high-level summary points here, Patrick, and then I'm really going to hand it over to you to discuss each one of these specifically, and then for Kat and I to offer some perspective and commentary. I do just want to acknowledge there are a host of realities affecting nonprofit leaders today. This is what I'm hearing, and my colleagues at CCS are hearing, this continuous notion or even this pressure to do more with less and limited resources, navigating a host of leadership transitions at the C-suite level, at the board level, thinking about not just what's happening within the states, but geopolitically overseas, thinking more than ever, how do we make that compelling case, that credible, relevant case for support, diversifying revenue streams. We've seen what's happened and the impact of government funding and subsidy and otherwise, and the shifting composition of individual, corporate, and foundation giving. And of course, I don't need to say this to this group, but I will emphasize it anyway, attracting the very best and motivating the very best talent, many of which is on this conversation, on this call today. So thank you for permitting that. Just on the next slide, we'll see here. We also have this is basically the heart of the research, and Patrick, in just a minute, but there are probably 8 provisions roughly as we're seeing come across. We're paying attention to 4 of them in earnest, and for the purposes of today's discussion, there's the UCD, the Universal Charitable Deduction. We think that this can be a positive effect because now non-itemizers can deduct up to 1,000 and 2,000 jointly. So ideally, that tends to bring in broader participation for the philanthropic marketplace. Secondly, we're taking a look at this adjusted gross income floor, meaning north of 0.5%. So that could potentially reduce some giving around itemizing households who are already thinking about that. There's a little bit more of a cost that's involved in that contribution. The third piece is really this 35% deduction gap, and that's reduced a little bit more. I believe, Patrick, you'll correct me here, but maybe from 37% to 35. It doesn't feel like a lot, but it actually is at mass, at scale, and in the aggregate. And then finally, the corporate floor. Anytime you increase a floor, it could have effects below the line and above the line, but create more of a cost or a disincentive below the line. So when we net that out numerically and mathematically on the next slide, we get a little bit of a waterfall effect here. And you can see those 4 main points that we described. Okay, if we get broader and bigger participation more broadly, which, by the way, Kat, we talk about this all the time. That's a positive thing for America, for the sector, for the industry, to have more people participating by voice, by contribution, by charitable commitment. And hopefully that could attract millions of donors. That would be a net lift. And then the other 3 factors that I mentioned, the floor on individual giving, the floor on corporate giving, and the reduction from 37 to 35, that could have a negative effect. So net, there is the possibility this could be affecting in a negative variance toward of tilt up to 1% of total giving. The last measured was about $585 billion. There's a whole host of other factors around this. This is stabilizing for just these factors, which I think we're going to get into right now. So with that, I would turn the conversation over. And if we want to go to the next couple of slides, please. Patrick, over to you, please.
All right. Thanks, Greg. So we're going to start out talking about the impact of HR1 on household giving, but we'll also talk about corporate giving. Next slide, please. So the household giving is affected by a couple of different aspects of HR1, and the one that we're the most excited about in some ways is the creation of a permanent universal charitable deduction. And so because this grows participation, what this does is for every single household, they can deduct up to $1,000 as non-itemizers. So we know about 90% of households are non-itemizers, take the standard deduction, and for marrieds filing jointly, they can take up to $2,000 deduction in charitable contributions. There have been prior experiments with UCD, Universal Charitable Deduction, but they were always temporary and they were small dollar amounts, like $300. And so, well, I would suggest respectfully that 1,000, 2,000 is too low if we really want to optimize philanthropic giving, that it is a much bigger starting point than we've had in the past, and therefore a good thing. Our estimates suggest that this will add between 6 and 8.7 million new donors annually to the stream of donors that are giving. Not all of that will happen necessarily the first year. What we have found following TCJE, JA, was that some donors reacted the first year, others took 2 or 3 years to kind of recognize that it fit their profile and they were better off making these donations above the line. So we'll see this with a likely gradual impact, but it will have a cumulative impact as well. The revenue effects are that we project that this will have between $2 billion and $4.4 billion increase. And in fact, we think the most likely effect will be a $4.4 billion increase in charitable giving by households per year. Now, this is not to say, I want to put in this footnote carefully, this is not to say you're going to read in the newspaper next year that household giving went up by 4.4 billion. This is just one piece of the effects, and that this is looking at the pure policy effects. And what we know is that changes in income, changes in wealth, changes in corporate profits can affect giving in lots of different ways, and they ripple through the economy. But what our study did was we try to isolate statistically what is the pure policy effect of each of these different policies. So when we give these numbers, please keep that in mind that these are the pure policy effects. They're not our forecast as to what will happen in 2026, 2027, and so on. And then finally, how does this break out? We think that about $3 billion of this increase will come from increased giving among existing donors. So they have this tax deduction that they're like, oh, I'm going to take advantage of that. And they're going to give more. In fact, most of the dollars come from that. And a $1.34 billion increase from people who are not currently donors. And so, as Greg alluded to in the introduction, one of the beautiful aspects of the big, beautiful bill is in a democracy, it's important for more people, most people, to participate in the civil sector more broadly. And this universal charitable deduction, or UCD, as we say in business, will broaden participation and increase participation financially and, kind of one person, $1, one vote. We'll see more and more of that. Next slide, please.
And Patrick, before we do, just for a moment, Kat, would love to invite any perspective you have on this as well. How does policy one strike you?
Well, I want to underscore one of the things that Patrick mentioned, which is particularly in a democracy. We have three sectors that all contribute in our society thriving. It's the government sector, it's the business sector, and it's the nonprofit philanthropic sector. So we should all be encouraged that one of the potential policy results would be more participation, because that is something observers of our sector have been concerned about, which is the decline in the number of households that seem to be giving, and the concentration in households that represent ultra high net worth, very high capacity, because what that does is it skews where those funds could be going and what informs them. In a healthy and vibrant democratic society, you would want to see as much participation across all households as possible. And if that happens, that would be encouraging.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Kat, because often we've seen this pyramid effect, right, of a constructing, whether it's a gift table or an annual fund on the fundraising side. It's become more and more like the shape of an Eiffel Tower because of narrowing participation, but outsized gift and influence. But then that is at the discretion of a smaller group of donors. So that broadening participation, just to emphasize it again. Patrick, I don't know if you had another comment here or you wanted to go on to policy two.
Yeah, just super quickly, but I think relevant to Kat's point, one of the things that the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy has been doing is tracking giving by households using a panel study over time. And one of the things that we've seen is that pre-Great Recession, that giving levels, about two-thirds of households participated in some form or another of donating to charities. And that fell starting with the Great Recession and has continued to fall, regrettably. And now it's under half. And our projection is if when these 9 million new donors come online, that will grow the participation rate back to 52% or over half. And I think just psychologically and from an efficacy perspective and a democracy, small d democracy perspective, that is really important. So I want to just highlight that for a second. But yes, next slide, please. So the second policy is a 0.5% floor for deductions. And so what this means is that deductions below 5% of one's AGI are still legal gifts. They still count as a gift, but they're not tax deductible. And so you have to push above that half of a point to be able to deduct your gifts. And so what that suggests is that our range is that between 1.8 and $3 billion in giving will be lost. Our most focused estimate is, or what we think is the most likely, is a negative $2.4 billion effect on dollars given. And I think one of the things that may also come with this is that some households may combine their giving in one year. They may bunch their giving, it's called. And so they may use a donor advised fund, or they may just pre-give one year and then not at all another year. And so, charities need to be aware of the implications of that and may look at things from a multi-year perspective. But I think that not everybody can afford to bunch their giving, right? Not everybody can afford to create a DAF. Not everybody can afford to give $10,000 this year to one charity and 10,000 to another charity instead of giving 2,000 a year each or 1,000 a year each for 5 or 10 years respectively. So I think there's going to be a broad spectrum of reactions to this floor, but overall we think it'll have a negative pressure on total dollars given.
Thanks for sharing, Patrick. Kat, any perspective on this one, either concern or opportunity, or just interpreting the data as they
Yeah.
are?
Well, I appreciated at the onset that Patrick made very clear that these are results of understanding the kind of pure policy um, implications. Uh, we know from participants in our High Impact Philanthropy Academy and Advising for Impact that sort of philanthropic decisions are multifactorial. And so, yes, tax policy can shift things in the way that the report shows. And so I think what'll be interesting to see are like what are the other factors that may mitigate this? And some of the things that we're seeing are the growth in collective giving efforts. We know that it can sometimes be hard to do something alone, but we see both the confidence and the passion that gets unlocked when people give together. And it can prompt people to give more than they would have on their own. Another thing is every generation, sort of, it's natural, wants to do more and better than the generation before them. So we are also seeing, again, through our own education programs, a cohort of next gen donors who not only seem less influenced by tax implications, but are, to be candid, sometimes a little cranky at their wealth management teams for emphasizing tax benefits so much when what is motivating them is the desire to create a better world with their wealth.
Yeah, Greg, if I can just follow up on Kat's comments
Please.
and to reinforce that, so what we have calculated is what we think are the best estimates using, a variety of data sets and two different panel studies and IRS data and so on. And we tempered these results a little bit because what we know is that some households are kind of ultra rational. So they're going to take the tax code and they're going to maximize their giving subject to the new tax code, and they're going to be kind of ultra rational agents, right? But we know many households, if you make a commitment to tithe 10%, 1%, 5%, pick a number, it doesn't matter. But if you pick to your mass mosque synagogue congregation, you're not going to change that number in the middle of your commitment based on, a relatively minor change in the tax implication, right? And so some of philanthropy is habit and culture and tradition, and some of it is, you've got a tax accountant, tax lawyer, and they're kind of chirping your ear about, well, wait, pay attention to this. So, I think Kat's exactly right that there may be generational differences, and we can discuss that more too. But I think that there are individual differences and family differences that are based on tradition and values and so on that may supersede the rational agent behavior as well.
That's a great call out, Patrick and Kat. I mean, both these rituals and these motivations. On the ritual side, if you make a pledge even, and if it's part of an annual giving campaign, you're likely to fulfill that pledge. Or if you're a monthly donor or a member, that will likely continue, to your point, Patrick. And then Kat, on the flip side with motivations, could be any number of things. And this is probably a good transition to policy 3 as well. But there's a whole host of factors. It could be gift recognition, it could be taxes, it could be reciprocity. And usually at the high end, it could be values or impact or the difference you want to make or the particular project or because you belong to a certain community. So these are all good things to raise in the spirit of this discussion. Patrick, how about policy 3?
Yeah, and Greg, I think it's a good point that you raised that all the things that we just discussed about the floor are also applicable to this policy of a 35% cap that reduces the value of itemized deduction. What's happening here is right now the top marginal tax bracket is 37%. And historically, the norm has been that one can deduct the full value of that deduction. And under the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, those deductions are capped at 35% rather than 37. So you may be paying 37% marginal tax rate, but the most you can deduct, the value of your deductions is 35%. But I think Greg's point and the other points that were made in the last round about if you made a multi-year pledge, I really don't think you're going to, recant on that gift by by the fact of, you get a slightly smaller um, tax deduction. Now, if you do the math on this, going from 37 to 35, it basically is like a 5.7% price increase. And while we all object to inflation, we all object to price increases, we all endure them. And, if we made $1 million or $5,000 multi-year pledge, I think we're not going to mess with that based on this cap. That said, because there are people who are ultra rational, they listen to their cost accountants or their tax accountants. We estimate that this cap will have between a $4 billion and $8 billion impact, and we estimated the most likely impact was 6.1, and that's based on what economists call the tax price elasticities of demand. How have people reacted to changes in the tax price or the after-tax price of giving in the past? I think two other factoids that are worth noting. In the IRS data and the data we have, we found that 57% of the itemized giving comes from households earning more than $500,000 a year, and that 48 come from itemizing households earning more than $1 million a year. Now, you can see this is a very abnormal or non-normal distribution. And in fact, my one statistical effort at humor here will be that philanthropy is all skewed up. And so philanthropy is very non-normally or skewed distribution. And a lot of the, a small number of people making a lot of the dollar volume total giving. And then on the other end, you've got a large number of people making gifts that are important to them, but are smaller in comparison and cumulatively are a smaller share of the total giving. So I think the 35% cap will reduce the value of itemized gifts. It will have a deleterious impact on the total amount giving by some households, but for all the reasons we discussed about the floor, they won't have the same impact on everybody.
Thank you, Patrick. What do you think of this one, Kat?
Well, I'm sort of looking at this as well as the prior sort of policy too, and in addition to some of the factors that we've already talked about that we know affect giving, so values and tithing that would sort of make some of these annual changes less relevant. I am curious about how they will result in something that Patrick mentioned earlier, which is this notion of bunching, right? So people's financial and economic status is dynamic. A household is dynamic. One year over another, they have different goals. They might have variability in their income, pledges that are coming due, not coming due. And so what I'm thinking about is to what extent might this result in a kind of bunching of gifts in order to optimize tax benefit? And if if donors, if households start thinking about a time frame that's not an annual time frame, but say maybe a 3 or a 5 year time frame, um, that again could be promising, because if you think about what philanthropy funds, what donors care about, and some of the major social issues, whether it's homelessness and housing insecurity, or improving educational access for children who don't have high quality education, reducing gun violence, etc. These are not the kinds of issues where uh, progress is going to happen quickly in 1 year, right? These are longer term. These require longer term investments. So that's sort of what's in my head right now, is that to what extent will these policies um, encourage timing across a longer time frame that frankly might match better to what the nonprofits need to be thinking about when they're trying to figure out, okay, how do we use philanthropic funds to create the change we seek?
Yeah. And Kat, if I could just add one more thing to your point about the bunching. Um, the people in this tax bracket might bunch in a different way too. Some of them are owner entrepreneurs, some of them are partners in law firms or medical practice and so on, and they may bunch their income so that some years they're paying at a lower tax bracket and other years they're paying at a higher tax bracket, right? And there's a lot of reasons why they might kind of game the system, but particularly with some of these tax changes, they may say, well, I'm going to take a big hit in 1 year, but then in other years I'll be paying at a lower rate. And so this bunching strategy, is, as you said, multifactorial. It can work on both sides of the equation and can be driven by lots of different variables. So I just would say, as fundraisers, we need to consider the donor's circumstances, not only over a 5 year period, but how they might strategize during that 5 year period, year to year.
Patrick, I would say, and Kat, I'm struck by two things in this conversation. One, the possibility in certain respects, there could be an unevenness within a year, but
Right.
arguably more predictability over multi years, because it kind of forces a longer term thinking, a 3 to 5 year time frame, a 10-year bet, or something like a deeper commitment to a cause that could be of longer duration. And I think, Kat, you really spoke to that a little bit. And then Patrick, you mentioned about skewing and from a statistics perspective there. I do wonder, because we always hear about the Pareto principle and how it applies to many things in life, from original observations, and that's the old 80-20 rule, and maybe it's a 90-10 rule, and in some instances it's a 190 rule, and you just wonder, does this skew that further? Does it bring it back again? Is it more like a power law or a Pareto principle? So it's at least curious to consider those type of implications from this as well.
Yeah. Yeah, Greg, I think there is a Pareto principle kind of in effect, but I think we're well past the 80-20,
Right.
and maybe it's 5-95 or something like that. Or at least 90-10. And I think one other comment about this bunching thing is I would encourage fundraisers and their charities and fundraising consulting firms, when evaluating the performance of the fundraisers, that it might become even more important to look at this in a multi-year manner, knowing that some of your biggest donors may be bunching their giving, that some of the medium-sized donors are bunching their giving. So you may have an ebb and flow year to year that's very idiosyncratic and driven by individual timing decisions that looks differently than it has in the past. And so, uh, and particularly as people learn and understand about what are the consequences and the strategies for dealing with those consequences of these new tax effects.
Right. And Patrick, you mentioned, as it relates to talent, that also relates to budget and goal setting year on
Right.
year. Do we need newer, more dynamic models to forecast and reforecast for that as well? So this has been a great discussion. Maybe we could move on to policy 4 as well here.
Yeah, so policy four has to do with corporate giving, and I think this is the same kind of issue that we talked about for individuals, but it's a 1% floor for corporate giving, and we are estimating a range of $1 billion to $2.5 billion. Our most likely was $1.5 billion, and there's a couple caveats to this, and I think so the way this works is again, gifts up to 1% of that floor are corporate gifts and they're described and counted as corporate gifts, but they're not tax deductible. It's only once one surpasses that 1% floor are they tax deductible. And so, this may affect the psychology of giving. Some may say, well, I'm giving less than 1%, so why bother? I don't, or they may say, well, this is my habit, this is my commitment, this is my culture. I still want to demonstrate to my workers, my employees, my consumers, my shareholders that I'm active in the community and I'm active philanthropically. But what we estimate is that 26% of total corporate giving may lose its deductibility. And that 40% of corporations anticipate adjusting the timing structure, this bunching phenomenon that we talked about before. Now, on the next slide, we can see that 28% of the firms in a CECP survey give more than 1% of their gifts. And shockingly, so this is a survey of CECP members, and these are tend to be the largest companies in the United States. And they accounted, these top 28 firms that gave more than 1% accounted for 89% of the total giving in that sample, which when we compare to the total giving by corporations in Giving USA, they constituted about 70% of total giving. So again, you see, the 80-20 rule. In this case, it's the 28-70 rule. So the top 28% of firms are accounting for 70% of corporate giving. So they're already above and beyond that floor. Now, they may still bunch and they may still strategize to get more of their dollars in 1 year above that threshold. And the smaller and medium-sized corporations may bunch to get above that floor every year, right? And so, or every other year, or every third year. And so you can see a lot of, I won't say gaming the system, but making rational choices that we as fundraisers and we as fundraising consulting firms and and we as policymakers need to understand and expect and plan for.
Kat, how are you thinking about corporate giving overall and potentially as a result of these shifts?
Well, I'm struck by how just as household giving is multifactorial, tax implications are just one. Um, the same is true in corporate giving. So, and Patrick alluded to some of this. So yes, there is a tax benefit that the corporation gets, and the policy um, uh, is changing when they get that benefit. Um, but many corporations have corporate giving for other motivations. Um, some of it is it's used as a way to burnish a reputation, right? To be viewed not just by customers, but as employees and especially new employees as we are a good corporate citizen. Look at all that we're doing in the community, right? That's not a tax benefit, that's a reputational benefit as one of the motivations for corporate giving. So that was one, is that just like as we talked about in household giving, I see the other factors that may mitigate the decline due to tax policy. The other is I feel like there are some really interesting innovations in corporate giving. So there used to be a time where, frankly, a lot of corporate giving was intermediated by United Ways. That
Right.
corporations gave to United Ways, and then United Ways were sort of the intermediary that then provided grants to nonprofits in a particular city or region. Um, I think the United Ways have that so much has changed in philanthropy that there are different ways that corporations are giving. So, for example, I mentioned collective giving earlier. This is would probably classify as a smaller corporation, but they decided that the way they were going to implement their corporate giving was not to be top down. Sort of, this is the corporate, somebody in central is determining where these gifts and grants go. Instead, every region had a giving circle, and that giving circle was comprised of both the regional president and some of the more sort of junior uh, employees, and all of them contributed to determining where the funding would go. Okay. When that is your mechanism, while tax policy may affect how much gets allocated, if the allocation is coming from headquarters, the way people are giving is very different and influenced by what employees are feeling and seeing and experiencing locally. And if those needs are high, right, that can go right back up to saying, hey, if we're going to be a good corporate citizen, like we need to be thinking broader and differently beyond what the tax policy might suggest our corporation should do.
Your great points and other factors as well. And Kat, you're spot on with workplace giving and what it has meant historically, how it comes to fruition today. And there are a host of factors. CCS has done studies on this as well. I mean, first and foremost, you expect companies will have to be profitable to continue to fund certain charitable missions. Secondly, mission alignment, first and foremost, among co-equals. But to your point, it's not just shareholders, there's stakeholders, and there's that consideration of that full, whether it's, customers, but employees in particular. We find that that's where a lot of the motivation comes. Historically, it might be on the whim or the singular priority of the CEO, but that was also an outgrowth for those workplace giving campaigns, which people would joke you're kind of voluntold in a way. Is it truly voluntary? And I think there's a dynamic in
Exactly.
that playing out here too.
Yep, that's right.
Patrick, maybe we have a few other provisions that we could at least acknowledge, and then we might shift gears to give a little bit of guidance based on these findings, and then might have 5 or 10 minutes to respond to many of the questions, dozens of questions that have been flowing through, and we'll try and organize those in 3 or 4.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Greg. So here are 4 provisions of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that John Bergdahl and I, who did the estimations and writing for this report, wanted to acknowledge, but also want to acknowledge that either we didn't have the data and or we didn't think they'd have much of an effect. We didn't have the data to quantify them in a precise manner. So, the standard deduction is increased dramatically, and the SALT limit increased dramatically from 10,000 to 40,000 for those earning less than $500,000 a year. I'm rounding, and then they're phased out. It goes back to 10,000 for those earning up to more than $600,000 a year. I think these things work in opposite directions, and they probably net out, and they probably are de minimis in their net effect. So they're there. Pay attention to them on your filing, but they're probably not going to affect giving in the aggregate very much. Policy 6 is increasing the limit from 50% to 6% of AGI. So this basically allows higher income donors to deduct a larger share of their income in any one single year. Now, excuse me, I spent a lot of time this weekend with a bunch of little grandkids, and they all had colds. So now I've got a cough. But this 60% cap is really, it's more show than tell, because the people who are donating 50% is a remarkably small percentage of the population of even on the high-end donors. Someone donating more than 50% in 1 year, and they can carry forward any unused donations for up to 5 years. And so I don't think that has much of an effect. However, 2 studies have found that people donate, some people, not everybody, but a few people donate every year more than they conduct even after the 5-year carry forward. So, excuse me, their commitment to philanthropy exceeds, their tax demands. And so again, these are very, motivated by philanthropic impulses or culture and values, and not as motivated by the tax code per se. Excuse me. Similarly, on the effects of the bequest giving, the levels of the state tax exemption were raised dramatically with TCJA and now slightly adjusting for inflation and permanently. And so only the very largest states can take a tax deduction anymore. But we still have seen in the last decade um, that for a decade before TCJA and the 7 years since then, that the amount of bequest giving has gone up by about 25% per year. So it doesn't seem like the adverse tax consequences of leaving a state gift have reduced bequest giving. And in Q&A, I have some hypotheses I can discuss with you if we have time, but if not, I just want to give time for questions. And then this education freedom tax credit is going to go into effect with a lag. And the only reason this may affect philanthropy is that households will be able to take dollars that were going to go to taxes and take a tax credit for gifts to K through 12 schools, private schools. And so, that's very much of a niche market. But, I'm a little concerned that that might reduce philanthropic giving to the educational subsector. And so, obviously, we'll have to see. This is new. We'll have to see how that plays out. But I do think that that's something to watch in the future.
It's great. Thanks for rounding us out on this, Patrick. Kat, any other observations you'd like to offer for any of these four policies?
Well, I think this has implications for fundraisers in that, these different policies affect different segments the of funders. And
Hmm.
so for nonprofits, in order to understand how this might affect your work, you really need to understand who your donor base are, and which of these is going to matter to your supporters. Um, but all of these, as Patrick outlined, they may be relevant for some and not relevant at all for others.
It's great. Thank you, Kat. Why don't we go through just a couple of more slides here that we have key takeaways and action steps. And after we do that, I will circle back with a few questions around how does this change? We've talked a lot about sources, but how might it impact uses when we think about different segments within the sector of education or international philanthropy? Also thinking about how do we educate the general public around UCD and then other things, more nuanced questions within policies. Okay, if the floor is, 0.5% in a way, could that motivate people to give more money to cross that threshold? So there are a couple of other questions in that spirit. But before we do, Patrick and Kat, we'll circle back to that. Let's just spend another minute on this concept. It was brought up before. We all brought a perspective. This notion of bunching gifts in key tax years. And actually, what does that mean? That's on the next slide. And we talked about it, right? Combine multiple years of giving, a single tax year. Patrick, you brought it from the income side, maybe through professional services. Kat, we're talking about it from a philanthropic side, and how do you time that? Some of this feels like a daft strategy as well, right? Because you think you have a motivation to give and you have a certain amount of money. Maybe it's an exit year, a liquid year, or some type of year that's bigger than usual, and you want to have the advantage of but you still kind of control the flow and the designation or the timing of which altogether. So I just didn't know if either of you wanted to make another comment or two, thinking of our audience today as nonprofit leaders and fundraisers, almost what can we or should we do about this, or how to influence it from a giving perspective?
Mm. I mean, in some ways, this goes back to my last comment, which is the need to understand your funder base, and how these policies will affect them. Because part of what can be challenging for a nonprofit leader, on the one hand, um, the idea that you could get uh, funds that could be used over more than 1 year, say, of operations. Every manager, whether it's a for-profit or a nonprofit, would like to have more confidence, no, and know when the money's going to be there and how much. So anything that reduces uncertainty can be a great thing for any organizational leader. But there's the bunching that could be the right time for the donor that may not be the same way that the nonprofit is managing. And
Mhm.
so what I'm concerned about is how well is the communication so that when the donor is considering bunching, that will match the capabilities that the organization has to handle that. The reason I say this goes back to my earlier comment. It means understanding whether or not this is even a factor for some of your donors, and if so, how they're approaching it, so that you can align the timing of your plans with the timing of those gifts.
Yeah, Kat, I think that's a really important point. Excuse me. And I think the communication is bilateral, right? So the nonprofits are communicating, asking, soliciting, making the pitch of why and why now and so on, and building their case. On the other hand, the donors, a lot of people are skeptical of DAFs, donor advised funds, for a lot of different reasons. And if we were to design the laws around DAFs today, with the experience we've had in the last decade or two, those laws would be different. I'll just acknowledge that. That said, I'm pro DAF because it allows for, somebody who sells their business and wants to make a major commitment to philanthropy, allows them to make that commitment when they have that burst of funds, but without making all the individual decisions about where that money goes all at once simultaneously. But I'm pro DAF for that reason and others. But at the same time, I think there's going to be more people using DAFs than there have been in the past because of what we've talked about, these particular policies. But I think that it's incumbent upon the donor to let the charity know, look, I'm giving you 10,000 or 50 or 100,000 this year, but I'm not going to give you a dime over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, whatever it is. And so I'm truly bunching in my giving. And so unless you need me to give you $1 every year to say, you know, you had so many donors, fine. But my actual real gifts are going to come once every 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And so you need to plan financially around my financial plan, which may not be the same as it was historically, the same amount every year, or some growth factor. So I think that's, that level of communication is not always going to happen, but it'd be bad for the nonprofit to get this big gift from a DAF and then think, oh, this is the new annual fund gift from that donor. Maybe it is, but I think more often now it's going to be maybe it isn't, and plan
Yeah, that
accordingly.
communication is so important. You both raise this in different ways, but to have that predictability and understand, is this repeatable or not? Is this a one-off move because of
Right.
these effects and these implications? Maybe we'll just move to the next slide here, thinking about how do we position for this policy shift and reinforcing these major donor relationships, thinking about the broad base of donors to activate that giving, or side bunts and live bunts some years, but not last year, but not this year. How do we go back to reacquire or to acquire donors with this new information and incentive? We've talked a little bit about this point number 3, planning for revenue variability, and that could have the bunching effect, as there's two sides of the coin on that. And then also preparing probably tailored communication plans from institutional leadership, from the C-suite through all fundraisers and ambassadors, according to programs and otherwise, but even the boards, how they are the champions and the stewards for the cause. And I would just invite perspective, Kat and Patrick, on positioning for this policy shift.
Yeah, the one that's standing out for me because it's just so challenging for the leader of any organization is the revenue variability. Um, and partly why that's on my mind is not only because it is so hard to manage, but also our team in partnership with social finance and Wharton Impact recently, actually, I think it will be released publicly soon, did a new report on PRIs, program-related investments. If you have a DAF, it's similar to a recoverable grant. And one uses of a common and often easy use of a PRI, or recoverable grant, can be to help smooth out revenue variability. So if there is a nonprofit whose work a donor really cares about, and they are entering a phase where there's a lot of revenue variability because, because of a new tax change, or because they get some money from the state, and the legislature is still debating whether or not they're going to release funds, right? Recoverable grants, PRIs, can be a way to smooth out that variability. It's basically, it could be a no cost loan, right? The kind of working capital that businesses have access to, but nonprofits don't. So that's the first place I went, was there are philanthropic financing tools that smart funders are using that can address that particular risk for nonprofits.
It's a great insight, Kat. Love that working capital concept as well here. Patrick, any other thoughts on this one before we move forward?
Yeah, so just really quickly, and I'll just put out an empathy note for the development staff at charities, because many times that's one person.
Mm.
And sadly, many times that is not one person, it's the CEO or the president, whatever the title is, and with some clerical assistance. Lots of charities don't have a designated fundraiser. But yet, what these 4 points make is a requirement for different strategies, major donor relationships, that's a different conversation, right? You're trying to solicit major gifts and keep those coming in spite of these tax changes. Activating the bases, how do we get new donors? And how do we keep new donors and grow them at the kind of entry-level gift level? That's a different conversation, a different strategy, different fundraising techniques. And so when you're a one-person shop, I think that's more complicated. I think Kat covered the revenue variability, and some CFOs and some CEOs are adroit at these tools, and some may not have ever heard of them before, right? And so, how do we diversify our income and expense flows, and how do we use some of these other tools that we may not be comfortable with? And then I think this last one is more important than I want to admit, really, is board leadership. When you're seeing this variability, I think we're likely to see this variability in fundraising successes year to year. Someone that may be new on the board or old on the board, but someone who wants to make a statement, may be irritated with the development office and say they need to go because we had a bad year, because get a big gift in one year, and then because of the bunching, that doesn't come in the next year. And then 3 years later, it comes in again. I think for board members, I think the development staff and the CEO have to talk to them about, here's what's likely to happen, and then show why it is happening when it happens, and say, so let's take a more holistic, multi-year view of how the development office is performing.
Thank you, Patrick and Kat. And I would just close with a few remarks on the next slide, and then we might have time for one question within 3 or 4 minutes, Kat and Patrick. I think we're up for it. And I'm really interested on the uses side of this capital. But what we are seeing at CCS is that we think there are actionable moves that nonprofits can take right now. Do an assessment, or at least an inventory, of your top 25 to 50 donors, and think about that risk and those risk mitigation strategies that were offered there before. Potentially flag donors who might be candidates for this bunching or pledging or acceleration of gifts, and think about that throughout the annual cycle in 2026. Thirdly, you could also consider adjusting the solicitation calendar and how that might make sense and time up with also donor events and circumstances and considerations. This has been mentioned several times, but on point 4, just clear guidance, education, being a good steward of the sector, the nonprofit mission, and of philanthropic resources, sharing information, offering perspective about likely shifts and implications. And then we mentioned this several times, but it's worth reiterating, especially from a board perspective, a leadership perspective, and throughout the nonprofit, but to reinforce a mission first approach and the impact and the outcomes that your nonprofit is seeing as a good steward and utilization of these charitable dollars. So with that said, Kat and Patrick, any final commentary just on the uses side? We talked a lot about the sources, individuals and companies all together. Any theory or implication of how this might impact if certain sectors move a little bit or receive more or less funding when we think about international philanthropy or faith-based or anything in between? And I recognize it's a little bit of a lightning round with just a couple of minutes left here.
Yeah. Great question, Greg. And I hate to do the bait and switch, but I am thinking of those takeaways you just shared and that very last one about mission messaging first. I kind of want to leave with this thought for the audience. This is a fantastic report, and everybody should access it so you can get behind some of what Patrick shared. Know that there is a whole industry of folks who are going to be talking about the tax implications for the donor. I would love to see the leaders of the nonprofits be the go-to for how philanthropic capital makes the world a better place. That's where you are experts. Because if you think about donor decision making, back to our earliest comments, it's multifactorial. I still don't know, self-selecting group who would come to any of the Center for High Impact Philanthropy's programs, but tax implications, tax benefit is just one of multiple factors that we see donors use. And if the nonprofit leaders on this call can fully embrace, you know how to take philanthropic capital and turn it into impact, that can be great ballast against, but you're not going to get like the same tax benefit the way you've been doing it, right? Make sure there's as strong a understanding of the impact story as there is of the tax benefit.
It's terrific, Kat. Patrick, final 30 seconds over to
Okay.
you.
So in terms of the distributional effects on the user side, I will say that if there's one group that will be the least affected by these changes, I would say it's giving to religious organizations. Your tithe is kind of your covenant between your mass mosque synagogue congregation, but also your divine spirit, however that's addressed and defined. And you may just feel, I'm a cradle Catholic. I mean, just that raw guilt if you're not doing what you said you're going to do every week or every month, that in terms of the tithe. And so I think that that's a factor. And I think that's perhaps, and many Americans don't give to, faith groups. So, we have to acknowledge that, but that many do give to faith groups and that their tithe is kind of a covenant. And I think that will be the least affected by these tax changes. Similarly, if you're in the middle of a multi-year pledge for, your kid's high school or your alma mater and so on, you're probably not going to deviate from that because, of these tax consequences. And generally, those tax consequences are relatively small, and some are in favor of making that tithe or making that annual payment. So I think for those two areas, they'll be probably the least affected. I think international arts, some of the other public health things are probably more subject to, the strategies of bunching and
Right.
and giving once every 3 years or 5 years.
Thank you, Patrick. And thank you again, Patrick and Kat. Outstanding conversation. We'll have to have a follow-up and really appreciate everybody's time and engagement. Lots of questions. You can access the full report just here on the QR code. Thanks again for spending your time with us at CCS, Indiana University Center for High Impact Philanthropy, University of Pennsylvania. Thank you, everybody.